All right, thank you everyone. Panel 5, let's get started. Climate in the environment, our second panel on climate for Washington Weekend. I'm just gonna quickly introduce our speakers, starting with Brett Marsh, representing UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Tanishka R. from the Missouri School of Journalism, my alma mater, so shout out to Mizzou. Colleen Henegan from the University of Wisconsin. Kristen Elliott from Northwestern Medill School of Journalism. Jana Rose Schleis, another Mizzou person, and Kristen Chin from Boston University. All of that said, I will let them share more about their projects.
Hello, everyone. Sorry. My name is Brett. I did a project in Colombia. The title of my project is called Where Coffee is King, A Crisis Looms. Before I get into the crisis, I will give a little background about myself and the work that I'm doing. So I lived in Colombia for several years, teaching English in regional schools, particularly in the country's coffee region. So a little bit of background on Colombia. I apologize for not providing a map. So for those of you who know where Colombia is, great, but it's in northern South America. Colombia is actually one of the world's most important coffee producing countries, and more than 500,000 families actually depend on coffee for their livelihood. And the interesting thing about coffee is that it's a very selective plant. It requires very specific growing conditions, and that includes particular water conditions, soil conditions, and also climatic conditions. So it's actually a very sensitive crop to climate change. But due to Colombia's varied climate and biodiversity, it's actually the second most biodiverse country in the world. There are multiple coffee producing regions and multiple communities that depend on coffee and have their own culture. So coffee cultivation in Colombia is generally small scale. The average acreage of coffee farms is about 3 acres, so it's quite small. But the work is very labor intensive. It's incredibly grueling. I will get into that a little bit later. But coffee plants require constant weeding, harvesting, and then there's the larger annual harvests that require thousands of workers across thousands of plantations. So the issue that I was exploring was this statistic that the average age of Colombian farm workers is 55 years old. It's actually rising a bit. The majority are men who have spent their entire adult lives, sometimes from the age of 8, 9, and 10, working in the fields doing physical labor. And most work is actually on short-term contracts, usually around 6 months. They're kind of considered wanderers, so they often travel hundreds of kilometers across different coffee regions to find work on farms based on the labor conditions, the quality of the coffee, and other factors. But the problem is that a lot of contact with family is limited, so that includes social and financial support. So a consequence of that is that few workers have pensions, Social Security, or personal savings, and very few have viable health care. So at the same time, young men in Colombia don't want to work in the coffee industry for understandable reasons. They're also feeling the pull to go to larger cities like Medellin and Bogota for work, also work that pays a lot better and also just providing a better quality of life and more opportunities. And everywhere in the world, higher education is the key to social and economic mobility. All right. So the question I wanted to explore was, who will replace the aging farm workers when they are gone? So I ended up in this state in Colombia called Antioquia, which is very emblematic of the problems happening in Colombia with the aging labor force, but it's also a very interesting place to look at potential solutions for this demographic crisis. There are a number of educational institutions that are enacting programs to try to get young people back onto coffee farms and back to rural Colombia. So that includes programs that work on sustainable farm management and also labor organizations that help promote higher wages and better working conditions. So as you can see, this is a stunning landscape, and these are coffee plants on the right, and they're just scattered all through the region. So I ended up going to several towns and basically just going to plazas and asking farm workers in bars where they were working and if they could invite me to their workplaces. Sometimes I found landowners themselves who were willing to invite me onto their plantations and talk to the workers. So on the right, this younger man is actually representative of this return to rural Colombia. He actually lived in Medellin, which is a city of several million people, and he returned to take over his father's farm when he got sick. And the gentleman on the left is 65 years old. He's been working on coffee plantations for his entire adult life. And he doesn't really have contact with his family. He hasn't seen his wife or children in about 10 years. So this gentleman on the left, I spent several days working alongside him. I contacted with him and was able to interview him and kind of follow him around, and then he kind of got sick of that and wanted me to actually work and use my hands. So the work is truly grueling. There are tons of insects. There's spiders, mosquitoes, wasps. There's ants that bite you. There's flies that bite. And then there's the heat and the rain that's kind of constant. I actually got bitten by some ants and my foot was swollen up like a hobbit's. So that was like a 5-day ordeal. Yeah, so this is another worker on a coffee plantation doing the periodic weeding that's required for this labor force. And this is another coffee worker who is 72 years old. Oh, sorry, this is the same one, excuse me. But actually this man ended up hospitalized for respiratory issues about a week after I left the farm where he was working. And on the left, I met this young man who also returned from Medellin. He tried the whole hustle in the big city and couldn't really find work, so he returned to his family's house, but he's unemployed and doesn't want to work on coffee farms. So he's trying to figure out a viable livelihood for him. So there's a challenge, like even for those who return back to rural Colombia, he's not really interested in, going into these education programs to become, a coffee farmer or, manage the land sustainably. This is another young man I met and his girlfriend who were living in this small town, and they were interested in taking advantage of some of these educational programs, but they were worried about not having the financial means to do so. So that's just a small taste of some of the work that I was doing in Colombia in March. There's some ongoing issues that I would like to explore. Some of them include the frequent use of pesticides and the public health implications on workers, especially when you consider that the workforce is older and already has more vulnerabilities to health issues, including the person that I mentioned who had respiratory problems. Yeah, and this also discourages younger people from wanting to work on coffee farms because of the public health risk. Wages and other labor protections are very minimal in Colombia, so that's something that needs to change from a legislative point of view. And I realize I am at time, so I will say last thing is that a lot of coffee farms are also being converted to avocado plantations to meet global demand for avocado and avocado toast. This is also due to a warming mountain climate that makes it easier to grow avocado, but it's also more profitable for farmers to convert their land to that crop. So just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hi, everybody. My name's Colleen. I'm a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm going to be sharing with you all my story about how farmers in Zambia are adapting to climate change. So when I first came to Zambia in 2019, it was one of the worst and most impactful droughts in the country that it's seen for decades. I was there to conduct food security surveys with a small rural community that was participating in a cricket farming project. And I know I say cricket farming, people might be kind of weirded out by that, or I don't know. But that was what I studied for my master's research, so if you have any questions about that, let me know. It's not the focus of this presentation, but I do love talking about it. But when I was conducting these food security surveys, I kept hearing the same phrase from the farmers. The maize failed when the rains didn't come. So in 2019, all of the money, the time, and the resources that the farmers had invested had come to nothing that year, and food was difficult to come by. And while the hunger season, which refers to the time when food runs out before the next patch of crops mature, happens every year, especially in semi-arid regions, the fact that there was no maize was troubling, as Zambians typically have enough of this one crop to last them until the next growing season. And maize in particular is a very important crop in Zambia. It accounts for over half of the calories consumed by each person in the country, and that's the second highest in the world after Malawi. And in addition, climate change is not going to be very kind to maize. For every 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, maize productivity declines by about 15%. So when I dug into the data around this issue, I found that southern Zambia, which you can see from that little magenta circle, is solidly in a semi-arid climate regime. And this area is not desert because of the seasonal rains that are brought by something called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ. And the ITCZ refers to the location where trade winds converge at the equator, creating a low-pressure zone with lots of precipitation. The ITCZ travels north and south of the equator, and it follows energy from the sun. And it's responsible for the dual rainy, dry seasons that are found in tropical areas around the world. Climate change has already made the ITCZ narrower and more intense. So some areas have started to receive rain less frequently, but when the storms do hit, they can be extremely devastating. So for my project, I wanted to learn more about how farmers are experiencing climate change. Are they noticing these shifts in rainfall and are seeing increases in temperature? And how do these changes impact their crops? So I started by visiting a colleague named Jeffrey Siulemba, who works for the Ministry of Agriculture in Zambia, and he's also a PhD student. As you can see from this quote, Jeffrey told me to visit a small village in southern Zambia that's called Lusitu, which he identified through his own research as a climate change hotspot. When my research assistant, Wansa, and I arrived in Lusitu, we walked through increasingly desert-like terrain that you can see from these images. There's sand dunes that were starting to form. You could see the roots of trees that had been deforested for charcoal, and increasing prevalence of succulents and cacti, which are not common in this region. So we kept walking through these areas, and then eventually we saw the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. And I know that this image doesn't really do it justice, but it was really, really beautiful. And so you see this patchwork of small farms that are located on the bottom of a dried riverbed. So that normally in the rainy season is filled with probably 20 meters of water in terms of height. And so that is where I met a woman named Enelis Chipenzi. And she's a lifelong farmer and a resident of Lusitu and a member of the Tonga tribe. And as she said, I grew up with dirt on my hands. Our family was always farming, and in the dry season, we farmed along the riverbed, but when the rains came and the river rose, we would farm above it. We grew food all year round, and my parents taught me all that I knew. Enelis told us that the area that we were farming was the basin of the Lusitu River, and that there was water just a meter or two below the surface of the dried riverbed. So people came to this area to farm in the dry season when the river was gone. But when she was younger, the river used to flow year-round. In addition to the drying of the river, which you can see here from this image, and this was taken in late July, and so we have probably another 4 months of dry weather until the rains come again. So in addition to the drying of the river, Enelis explained that the rain pattern has changed. It delays more often, and it doesn't come when we expect it to come. When I was young, we needed to plant our rainy season crops the first week of December or earlier, but now we need to plant after Christmas. If we plant too early, the rains come and go and we lose our crops, which is pretty much exactly what happened in 2019, and it's pretty much evidence of those shifts in the ITCZ that I told you about earlier. So then I spoke with Oscar Malamfu, who's an extension agent in Lusitu, and he confirmed that the Lusitu River became seasonal in 2016, so this is a fairly recent change, and he attributed this change to climate change. He said that Lake Kariba, the reservoir that's formed by the Kariba Dam, has decreased as well. And this is concerning as Lake Kariba generates 60% of the energy for Zambia and Zimbabwe. And it's the largest reservoir by volume in the world. It hasn't been at full capacity since 2011, which has decreased energy available for both countries, increasing the demand for charcoal and spurring deforestation in places like Lusitu, which then leads to the desertification that I witnessed on my trip. Given Kwapu, the city council chairman of Siavanga, explained that the Tonga living in Lusitu were displaced during the construction of the dam. So they originally lived in this area called the Gwembe River Valley, but that valley was flooded to make way for this dam. And prior to the dam's construction, the Tonga were relatively isolated from the British because the British thought it was a harsh and inhospitable environment, but the Tonga thrived there using ecological knowledge accumulated over generations. According to Given, the Gwembe River Valley was idyllic. The Tonga practiced flood recession farming, like you can see in this image taken in Lusitu. They had 2 growing seasons, ample grazing land, and they had a strong social network to support each other during times of drought. In 1958, the British forcibly removed the Tonga from their land to make way for the Kariba Dam, which was needed to power copper mines that were in the northern region of the country. As Given describes here, my mother fled the flooding of Lake Kariba when she was 8 years old, and there was quite a lot lost along the way, our culture and traditions. We have Tonga across the river that were forced to belong to a different country, even though they didn't want to belong there. The people across there are not Zimbabwean, they are Tonga. And the British brought a sea between our people, separating our families as they fled the rising waters. So the story of climate change and desertification in Lusitu took on a whole new meaning after I learned this backstory. And it's a reminder that climate change does not act in isolation. The social, historical, and political factors on the ground determine who is impacted the most, which are often marginalized communities. The rising floodwaters of Lake Kariba are almost an allegory of what I can see happening with climate change around the world. People from the global north are responsible for climate change in the same way that the British were responsible for the damming of the Zambezi River. And the Valley Tonga benefited little from the dam project, but were displaced and forced onto marginal land to make way for mining projects in the northern part of the country, just like many communities around the world are being forced to bear the brunt of climate change, even though they had little to do with the creation of the problem. And I was really struck by how resilient Ennelis was in the face of the changes that her and her parents had seen throughout their lives. She knew things were different, but she also had a confidence that her and her family would get through it. As she says here, "This is my home. This is where I raised my children. The bones of my parents are here. The rains in the river are changing, but we can only learn from it, help each other, and adapt where we can." And that resilience is something I noticed when speaking with other farmers across Zambia. While many of them, especially those without access to surface or groundwater, are facing significant climate-related challenges, they focused on building community, starting farm cooperatives, collectively applying for loans, village banking, sharing their knowledge and traditions to help each other adapt. And I'm deeply grateful to the Zambians, you can see here, who spent their time with me this summer, and to the Pulitzer Center for their funding, which allowed me to share these stories with you today. So thank you so much.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Kristen. I'm a graduate from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, where I studied science journalism, and I'm a climate science reporting fellow, so this is going to be a climate science talk. So I did a project on ice cores, so I'm going to just start with what ice cores are. So snow falls in Antarctica, obviously, and piles up year after year because it doesn't melt. So this is almost like tree rings in layer after layer on the Antarctic ice sheet. And so for about 50 years, paleoclimate researchers, so people who study ancient climate conditions, have gone to Antarctica to drill cores of that ice. These cores can be up to like 3 kilometers long and take up to a decade to drill. And they're important because bubbles of air frozen in that ice are the only direct record we have of ancient climate conditions, like the atmospheric composition going back that far. So carbon dioxide and methane and other gases, and the relationship between those gases and temperature over time. So they're the only reason we understand the climate change that's happening now. So the current record goes back 800,000 years, which seems like a very long time, but it's not nearly long enough to understand the full picture of climate change over time, because much longer ago, like 1 million to 3 million years ago, the Earth was last as warm as it will be in the next 50 to 100 years. So just to give some, these are not my images, but this is a photo of some ice cores in Antarctica. And there you can see those bubbles, which are ancient air trapped in ice. So there'll be a few charts like this, but this one shows, you can see that ice core record ends. And other proxy records of climate, like sediment cores, go back much further. And this is the time periods that scientists are trying to target with ice cores. Because after that, we're just kind of guessing at what the climate was like. So enter COLDEX, like all science things, an acronym for Center for Oldest Ice Exploration. And this is the project that I reported on. It's a National Science Foundation Science and Technology Center, which is the largest grants that the NSF hands out. So this team of researchers I worked with have $50 million and 10 years to find a location somewhere in Antarctica to drill an ice core that will extend the record back to 1.5 million years. So that sounds like it would, I don't know if it sounds like it'd be simple. You'd think that you could just go where maybe the ice is thickest and drill a core, but it's way more complicated than that because of factors involved with the ice. So like over time, the ice under its own weight flows out towards the edges of the ice sheet. It's actually melted from below because ice is a good insulator and the Earth is warm. And so scientists are going to spend 5 years doing reconnaissance. So they have radar on planes and radar on the ground, and they're trying to model ice sheets to figure out where the oldest ice might be, because the crust under the Antarctic ice sheet is actually the least understood part of geology in the entire solar system. The ice is just so impenetrable. And then another big part of COLDEX is drilling cores in the margins of the ice sheet. So the ice is very thick in the center, but at the edges, there's underground mountain ranges, and the flow of ice there pushes old ice up close to the surface where it's easily accessible, but that same flow messes up the ice. So you can't just drill straight down and expect layers. It's all jumbled up. And so scientists have avoided that ice for a long time, but they're starting to look at it because they think that may be the only way they can find really old ice. So here's just a little graphic from COLDEX of the drilling. So it's shallow drilling goes down not very far. Deep drilling, they build like these factories on the ice sheet to do drilling over many years. Another little graphic to show the flow of ice toward the edges. So as the sheet moves, almost like water, it grinds up against underground mountain ranges and comes to the surface. So you'd expect as you go deeper, this is like a depth and age graph, you'd expect that to be a straight line, but here in the edges of the ice sheet where they're drilling, it goes back and forth and is just pretty baffling to scientists. You can see there's, like if you took radar pictures of ice, you can see the individual layers like this. So they told me this is a whole new challenge, figuring out how to work with disturbed and messy ice, something that they've avoided for a long time, but now are forced to try and understand. And then I also want to mention a big part of this COLDEX effort is increasing diversity in the polar sciences. The geosciences especially have been dominated for a very long time by white male researchers. I was pretty shocked to hear that only 10% of PhDs in the geosciences have gone to people of color, like in the history of the field. And then there's big problems in Antarctica because of how remote it is and how male-dominated it is of sexual assault. A new NSF report just came out on that topic. So scientists are really also focused on how to counter these narratives, often perpetuated by the media, of a polar explorer being this like white bearded dude that goes and risks his life to explore Antarctica and make it a more inclusive place. So I traveled to a couple places for the reporting. I went to the ice drilling program headquarters in Madison, Wisconsin, which is maybe not where you'd expect there to be a big ice core presence, but this is where they build the drills and test them. And I also went to Oregon State University to visit the Coldex conference. So this is where I got to see some ice core labs I have a couple pictures of, and got to meet with scientists as they're really talking about and redefining the priorities of this field that's been around for a long time but is now changing pretty rapidly. So these are just a couple of shots of the freezers, these like really cold places where they keep the ice and cut it up and store it in facilities like this. And a couple shots of the lab. So various complicated processes to get gases out of ice cores. So if you ever see like a climate record, you can know that like for every data point on that record going back, it's like a day of work of analyzing gas in the lab. It's pretty difficult work. So thank you very much, and yeah, I'll take questions at the end.
Hi everyone, I'm Jana Schleis. I'm getting my master's degree in journalism at the University of Missouri. My Pulitzer Center piece was a 4-minute audio feature and an article that both ran on Wisconsin Public Radio. And the topic is about how the industries of agriculture and energy generation coexist, and how they will continue to do so likely in the future as both industries go through rapid change. So a little bit about where my story takes place. This is a Lake Michigan shore on the Wisconsin side. Two Creeks is this town right here. It has very, very small, only a population of 436, about 50 of which I'm related to. This is my hometown. And it's just 14 square miles. The two industries are nuclear power and agriculture, primarily dairy farming. Where it says Kewanee right here, there was a nuclear power facility that closed down about 10 years ago, but it is still there. And then in Two Creeks, where the story takes place, there is another nuclear power plant, 2 reactors. It's still operating and is a major employer for the area. And in the last few years, just in this 14 square miles, 2 large-scale solar farms have also been built there. So when I went about reporting this, essentially the news peg had already happened that these solar farms were built and were now running. So I wanted to explore how these two industries of Two Creeks coexist. And especially the economic situation of farmers, dairy farmers, who are partnering with the energy company to host solar panels on their land. Energy companies need access to what farmers have, and that is large swaths of land. So this is an environmental story, but it's also an economic story and an identity story, dairy farming being very important to Wisconsin. Another aspect I wanted to explore is what makes one location an ideal place to put an energy facility. And how much does the community factor into that? In response to climate change, renewable energy is growing very quickly. Consumers want it, businesses want it, and governments are pushing for it. So the pitch was, what does this renewable energy build out look like on the ground? So I traveled to Two Creeks in May and interviewed the town chairman and 3 farmers who are renting their land to the energy company. So I got tours of their properties and was able to see the panels up close. If you've seen a Wisconsin license plate, you'll see the nickname America's Dairyland. Much of the state's massive agricultural economy is made up of small family-run dairy farms, and that has been changing in the last 2 decades. This is Brent Sinkula. He's one of my sources. He's also the president of the Manitowoc Farm Bureau. And he explained it to me as sort of the middle is falling out of this industry. You have to get big to survive, and that is hard for a lot of small dairy farms. Brent is the only farmer I interviewed who is still currently managing an active dairy. Along with his father, who owns adjoining property, they signed a solar contract in 2018 to rent 500 acres of their land to one of these solar farms. And Brent gave me one of my favorite pieces of audio from the story. He was explaining how in 2018 and 2019, those were 2 of the wettest years in Wisconsin due to climate change, and it made it very difficult to get the crops off the field that year. You know, equipment was getting stuck and breaking, and then you had to pay more to dry the crop, and then you're getting less money for your yield. At the same time, when he's managing these challenges, he's approached about the potential of renting his land for the solar farm. I also spoke with Ken and Rita Duvenek. They are retired dairy farmers, and the solar contract allows them a secure source of income in retirement. Oh gosh, I'm so over time, I'm sorry. Without a buyer, retiring dairy farmers sort of have to sell off their livestock and equipment and land in pieces to get enough capital. And Ken really didn't want to do that. It was important to him that the farm stay intact and stay in his family. He's hoping to pass it on to his grandson. And this contract allows them to do that. And a big theme that came through as I interviewed farmers is their philosophy and how their identity is tied up with the idea that they contribute something to society. They contribute food or fuel, and that's very important to the work that they do. And as Rita described, it was sort of a hard decision to give up your land and your ability to do that. But in describing that, she gave me my headline by saying, "Now we farm the sun." This photo on the side here is from Lottie Frank's land. He is another retired farmer in Wisconsin. He's in his 80s and manages the orchard, and as he described to me, that's all he can handle at this point. Raising crops is very physically demanding, and the rent that the farmers get for hosting these panels is unfortunately or fortunately more than what they would make raising a crop on that land. A very big takeaway that I learned here is what goes into where you can site a renewable energy project is the grid. Currently, our grid is designed to take energy from massive facilities like this and then move it across the country to where the energy needs to go. We don't necessarily need that system in the future, as we can put renewable energy in more places and in smaller facilities, but until we upgrade the grid, we're going to need to place new sources of energy where there's currently access. At the beginning, I mentioned a closed down nuclear power plant along the lakeshore. The power coming from these 2 new solar farms is now being rerouted through that substation to get on the grid, so it's being reused in that way. This is a photo of Point Beach Nuclear Power Plant. The day I went to take that photo, as you can see, it's kind of dark. It was really foggy and really misty. And I didn't have my audio equipment with me as I was just taking a photo. And when I stepped out and I was standing under just 2 of these massive transmission lines, they were actually like crackling and making like a buzzing sound from interacting with the weather and all of the power going through them. And I'm telling this story only to say, as an audio reporter, I was really kicking myself for not having my equipment with me, because how often do you get a chance to say this is what energy sounds like? So sharing that story, just as a reminder, always be rolling. These folks up here are my parents. In my field note, I shared my personal connection to this story and my father's story. Really, a lot of the themes of his life play into this. They're standing on their front porch. My dad has lived here his entire life, and he was a dairy farmer. And as you can see, right there, literally in the backyard, is a massive transmission line. Okay. So lastly, I learned that renewable energy is going to need to be everywhere, and Wisconsin isn't the sunniest place in the world, or maybe where you would think of for solar power. And one of the energy experts I spoke to said every state and every region is going to need to figure out what renewable energy works best for them. And in Wisconsin, Solar is very productive in the summer where wind is not, and vice versa. Wind is very productive in the winter when the sun is not, so they need to complement each other. And these photos of Brent's cows grazing alongside the panels, I think, encapsulates my biggest takeaway, which is that the future of energy is going to be dispersed, integrated in communities, and regionally specific. I'm so sorry for being over time.
That would explain it. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen. I graduated from Boston University's Master in Journalism program last year. And today I am a filmmaker. I flip houses. I'm getting back into acting. And I write for the Neiman Storyboard. And that all sounds very unrelated, but there are two great passions that run through everything I do. The first is project management. And the second is telling great narrative stories that really move, touch, and engage and connect people. And that's what I did with my Pulitzer project, Snow Money. It's a 13-minute short documentary about climate change from a snowplow operator's perspective. And this is my snowplower. This is Joe. He is based in Boston. He is a carpenter and a father. He also is a landscaper. And I chose to work with him for a couple of reasons. The first was that, to be completely honest, he was the only person who would let me follow him around with a camera for 2 years. And the second thing that I loved about Joe is that he was younger, he's a person of color. That's a pretty unique demographic for a snowplower. And lastly, Joe was dealing with something that I just thought is so relatable. He is a father trying to make enough money to support his family. That's something that anyone can relate to. So I followed Joe for 2 years, and for the first year and a half of my project, I did everything myself. And by the end of that year and a half, so about this time last year, I was like, y'all know that headspace when you've been working on a project or a paper for way too long, and you're just like, my brain is melting. Someone please take this project from me. I was so frustrated and tired, and so I decided to hire 4 people. And then I decided to go out and get money to pay these people and reimburse myself for the time and equipment that I had spent on the project already. I raised almost $10,000, of which the Pulitzer Center was just an incredible contribution to that. And I also was introduced to my mentor, David Abel, who is here with us today. And I remember the first time that I met David on Zoom, I was in that headspace, right? And I came to David and was like, here's my project, I'm done, we don't even need to do anything. And in the most, in much more eloquent terms, and yet in no uncertain terms, David said to me, oh, Kristen, you're not done. And this started a whole new editing phase of the project that really took it to the next level. And I'm incredibly grateful for that learning experience. And it just allowed me to submit the film to different festivals, and we played at the Newburyport Film Festival. I'm actually leaving today so that I can be at the Boston Globe Film Festival tomorrow. And thank you. And we've also done a couple of, oh, thank you so much. Thank you. We've also done many community screenings so that we can share this work with people in the Massachusetts community, and particularly in blue-collar communities who can really relate to this story. So what I'm going to do is play a clip for you. It's about a 2.5-minute clip. It is the snow plowing part of the film. And then I'll share 2 interesting findings from my work. Yes, thank you.
It's much as everyone thinks because you're self-employed, you're your own boss, do whatever you want. It's like, we still have deadlines. There's days where we have no choice. Wet snow can be a nightmare. Just is like 100 pounds a shovel, it feels like. The type of snow can change the timeline on getting all the jobs done by 50%. We have single stage and 2-stage snow blowers. Once there's like 7 or 8 inches of snow and it's heavier, the paddles won't spin. Like they'll bog down and they just are useless. If we kept getting stuff like that, they make these snow sweepers that sweep the stuff out of the way. But that's equipment I don't have. This past year, we kept getting those like half rain, half snow storms where if you didn't beat it, then there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. It was probably the worst feeling having to like text, email, and call customers just to give them a heads up. Like, even if it's a centimeter of ice, it can be deadly. Check marks we did, the rest we haven't.
Thank you. I'm like moved every time I watch that because I'm like, oh my gosh, 2 years and it's finally done. Oops. Nope. Okay, so I did a lot of research on this industry, and it was really challenging because there isn't that much data about it, and most people are not really interested in speaking to a journalist, as you can imagine. But 2 interesting findings that I had, and there are many more that I'm so happy to talk to you about or answer as questions later on. One of them was that not all snowplowers believe in climate change. I know, crazy. But it really was a mixed bag, and I included this because I think it's interesting the way that they justify it. So people I spoke to said, like, they're used to a long game. They're used to some years being great and other years being not so great. And so some people actually see the changes in the weather patterns as part of a 5-10-year cycle, and it will get better. So that was one thing. And then another interesting finding was that the climate change impacts really vary by location. So particularly in Boston, the climatologists and meteorologists that I spoke to said that Boston can expect wetter, warmer, and more unpredictable weather, and in some cases actually more snow. So I talked to a couple of snowplowers who are expecting to have more business and make more money, and they're gearing up for that. So these were just 2 of my findings. There was so much more that I learned from this project, and again, would be happy to share. And in closing, I just really want to say what an honor it has been to present amongst all of you these incredible projects. I've learned so much about the world. And to the Pulitzer Center, thank you, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this way, but it has been the opportunity of a lifetime. Thank you.
All right, thank you, panelists. I think we all know the drill now, so I'd love to start with any questions that you all might have for one another. Kristen.
Thank you. This question is for Tanishka and Colleen, and I'm curious if you have noticed people leaving the areas and what that's been like for them.
So I haven't gone and reported as yet, but from the initial conversations that I've had, people are like the semi-nomadic communities, they are moving away from their lifestyle and sort of moving into cities wherein they can get permanent work, and that sort of culture is losing out. So yeah, people are moving.
Yeah, in my work also, I've noticed there's quite a movement of younger people to urban areas. There's a decrease in the need for manpower in terms of farming. But for the most part, people have not left the communities that I've seen. A lot of actually older people are returning to rural areas. Like there's one community where it was mostly like retired folks, which was really, really cool. So they had this like whole life experience, and one of them was like an engineer, and his thing was to install solar water pumps in the community, and really kind of building it up, which is pretty cool. So yes and no.
Any other questions from our presenters? Oh, yes, go ahead.
I had a question for Brett. So yeah, with the impacts of climate change in mountain regions, are you seeing coffee plantations moving up the mountains in elevation to try to escape those effects?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when I was in the coffee regions, coffee farmers themselves would point up mountains and show where deforestation had occurred, especially, because as I mentioned, coffee production is very specific to ideal climate conditions. So the warmer that Colombia is getting, the more difficult it is to grow coffee in the traditional areas. So they're going into higher elevations, and they're also going into completely different regions to produce coffee.
All right, any questions from our audience members? Yes, heading over to you, Victoria.
Thank you all for sharing your presentations. My question is for Kristen. So I was just wondering, with the time frame with the same subject, that 2 years, I find that really impressive. So did you have any periods in that time? Basically, my question is, how did you navigate what to include versus what not to include? Did you have any periods of sort of slowness where you got discouraged that maybe you weren't finding anything out that would be relevant, or conversely, did you have sort of aha moments throughout those 2 years of time while you followed your source around?
Thank you for the question. That's a great question. To your first question about what did I decide to include, it was very challenging. I think Joe and I did like 15 to 20 shoots in that time, and it really came down to the post-production process and working a lot with David and my editor, and really thinking critically about what is relevant to this storyline of, okay, Joe wants to buy his first house, and what supports that, what provides the important information. And you know that saying, kill your darlings or kill your babies or whatever, that was definitely a part of this project, where I had to cut some really great scenes, particularly of Joe and his family, that I loved. And then as to your question about whether or not there were periods where I felt like I wasn't finding anything, yes, there were definitely moments where I was filming him and I was like, okay, I've seen this already. But I am really glad that I was there for all of those times, because you really never know what you're gonna find. So there would be times when I was with Joe and I'd ask him a question that I'd asked him before, and he would just he'd just say something that I was just like, wow, like that's really great. I should really include that. So yes, there were redundancies, moments of like waiting and boredom, but I think it's good to have more going into the edit than less. Yeah, thank you.
This is a question for Kristen. I'm wondering if it becomes, more feasible to measure, to accurately measure atmospheric composition 5, 10, or even 50 million years ago. What would the impact of that be?
Yeah, so there are, I guess, points in the climate record that are particularly interesting to scientists. So, like 3 million years ago is a really big topic, like a big point of discussion, because that's when they think things were last really warm, like there was no ice sheets and that sort of thing. 50 million years ago, I think, is considered impossible just because all of the ice has melted over the Earth's geologic history. So I think 3 or 5 million years ago is the sort of theoretical limit, and the challenge is finding that ice that's that old, if that answers your question.
My question is for Brett. As I'm sure you know, there's a huge influx of Venezuelan refugees coming into Colombia and other migrants. Did you see any of migrants becoming involved in growing coffee beans and being involved in the production?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's one thing that I was curious about myself. I actually didn't see too much of it where I went. Definitely younger Venezuelans are flocking, much like young Colombians, they're going to bigger cities for opportunity, and with that there is, there are issues of discrimination and competition for work in the cities. So I suspect that there might be a migration of more Venezuelans into rural areas. To be honest, they're all over the country. There's Venezuelans everywhere, but they're not necessarily becoming a big labor force on the plantations. Not yet, anyway.
All right, we'll do Gabby coming your way.
Hi, I have so many questions for all of you because I loved all your subjects, but Brett's is really close to home, so it's another Brett question. Considering like coffee is one of the top exports in Colombia, like during your reporting, did you see if there was like any sense of urgency from government or buyers like Juan Barles to incentivize these coffee growers to keep at it essentially?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of scrambling to figure out the economic situation with the pandemic, and so really the people who were, kind of screaming the loudest about it were some coffee farm owners as well as coffee researchers. A lot of them specialize in finding like sustainable plant varieties for coffee plants, but they were also really concerned about the labor issue. But the problem is that there's just a lot of turmoil happening in Colombia at the time with the pandemic, and then the influx of refugees from Venezuela. So there wasn't really. It was kind of frustrating to realize from both like the people I talked to and then myself that there wasn't like this urgency behind it so much.
And then we'll just do one more question. Sorry, everyone, just for time's sake.
Hi, my question is for Kristen. Firstly, I love your passion for your work so much. You've spent like 2 years on it. My question is that you said that many people who work in the slow cleaning industry don't believe in climate change. And they believe that this is just part of the 5 to 10 year weather changing patterns, right? So what challenges, if any, do you think this poses to the global move against climate change, especially because these are people who work on the ground and are directly being impacted by climate change and yet don't realize it fully in some cases?
Yeah, thank you. So it's not that most people in the industry don't believe in climate change, it's that it's a really mixed bag. And that I'd say like, maybe a third of the people I spoke to thought it was part of this longer term cycle. And as for the challenge, I think it poses, to be honest, the group of people who work in snow and ice management, it's pretty small. It's a pretty small community. So I think what is how it could impact the global climate change movement is I'm not sure that it will, that such a small group of people has this take in this particular industry. But what I do think is important is looking at the data and continuing to observe weather patterns and just how plowers are continuing to deal with that and what their experiences are on the ground, kind of corroborating all of that together, which is what I did in my project. So thank you, great question.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you everyone so much for your questions. So like Kem has been saying, there's definitely more time to continue the conversations and the questions throughout the weekend. I am sorry that I couldn't get to everyone. I know it's been a long morning, so let's take, let's take like a 10-minute break. Like I said, I know it's a long day. Out of respect for everyone else's presentations, if you can try to get back in like 10 or so minutes, that's super appreciated.